74,000 years ago, the world almost erased us.
It wasn't war. It wasn't disease. It was a mountain. One blast in Sumatra, so powerful it could have turned Homo sapiens into just another fossil footnote. And somehow, we survived. But barely. Of all the apocalypses our species has flirted with, only one came frighteningly close to wiping us clean off the planet before we'd even had a chance to invent, say, indoor plumbing. It wasn't an asteroid, it wasn't aliens, it was a mountain. A mountain that, for most of its life, just sat there being a mountain, until one day it decided to quite literally explode with the force of millions of nuclear bombs going off at once. And when it did, the sky darkened, the oceans cooled, and a global winter set in that nearly erased Homo sapiens from the Earth's guest list. We're talking crop failure before crops even existed, famine when hunting and gathering were already barely keeping us alive, and a planetary deep freeze that some researchers think shrank the breeding population of humans down to just a few thousand survivors. It's the kind of catastrophe that doesn't just kill you, it tries to delete your entire species from the fossil record. And the craziest part, this wasn't in some mythical prehistory told around a campfire. This happened during the age of our direct ancestors, and their descendants are everyone alive today. So what was this angry mountain? How could a single eruption trigger a planetary near-death experience? And how did we, the squishy little primates we were back then, actually survive it? Let's rewind 74,000 years to the day when the Earth's crust decided to make our continued existence optional.
If you'd been alive in Southeast Asia around 74,000 years ago, you wouldn't have known it was coming. There'd be no dramatic rumbling weeks in advance, no biblical warning in the clouds. Just the same jungle mornings, the same humid air clinging to your skin, and maybe the occasional grumble from the horizon that you didn't think much about. And then, it happened. In the spot we now call Sumatra, a caldera named Toba decided it had had enough of keeping quiet. Imagine the loudest thunder you've ever heard. Now multiply it until the sound isn't just in your ears, but in your ribcage, your teeth, and your bones. That's what the first shockwave would have felt like. If you were still alive to feel it after the second one hit. The mountain didn't just erupt, it detonated. The top of the volcano, a chunk of rock the size of a small city, blasted apart in a flash of light that outshone the sun, instantly vaporizing everything for miles. Trees didn't burn, they simply ceased to exist. Rivers boiled, animals were thrown like rag dolls into the ash-choked wind. The air filled with a roar so deep it was felt across continents. And then came the ash. Not like the grey dust after a campfire. This was ash so fine it could sneak through the weave of your clothes, so thick it turned noon into midnight. Within hours, a curtain of darkness spread over the surrounding islands. Within days, it stretched over half the planet. From Africa to Australia, the sun became a ghost. The moon, if you could see it at all, hung dim and red in a bruised sky. Temperatures dropped faster than the survivors' chances of finding their next meal. In some places, a single lungful of air could choke you with enough glassy ash to scar your throat forever. And this wasn't a local tragedy. This was the kind of eruption that writes its name across global history. In this case, with a pen made of molten rock and a signature of death that would linger for decades. It was the first act in a planet-wide horror show, and it was only getting started.
It's hard to talk about the Toba eruption without sounding like you're exaggerating, because the numbers don't sound real. For starters, this wasn't just the largest volcanic eruption of the past 100,000 years. It was one of the largest known in the entire history of Homo sapiens. If you stacked the sheer force of every nuclear weapon ever built, and then multiplied that by a few thousand, you'd still be short. Let's put it in perspective. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the US. The one that flattened forests and made international headlines blasted out about 1 cubic kilometer of rock and ash. Toba, 2,800 cubic kilometers. That's not a typo. It's like comparing a bottle rocket to a full-scale space launch. Except the space launch blows up the entire launch pad, the parking lot, the town next door, and then changes the weather for decades. The energy released has been estimated at around 2.8 trillion tons of TNT, or roughly 100 million Hiroshima bombs going off back to back. If you could somehow stand far enough away to watch it safely, spoiler, you couldn't, you'd have seen the entire top of Sumatra disappear into the stratosphere in a single hellish moment. And speaking of the stratosphere, the eruption column shot so high into the atmosphere it essentially punched a hole in the sky, injecting ash and sulfur aerosols into layers of air that no storm could ever wash clean. Those fine particles spread around the globe like a death shroud, turning sunlight into a dim, cold glow for years. This wasn't just a volcanic eruption, it was a planetary reset button. In one day, Toba accomplished what human industry would take centuries to even approach. It altered the climate, the atmosphere, and the very trajectory of life on Earth. And down here, on the ground, that meant one thing. The survivors of Day 1 were about to discover that the real killer wasn't the eruption itself. It was the winter that came after. The day after Toba blew, the world woke up to a sky that looked like the end credits of civilization. There was no gentle sunrise, no golden light peeking through the treetops, just a flat, eerie glow, as if the sun had been replaced by a dying campfire behind a curtain of soot. Within weeks, the air chilled. Within months, the seasons stopped making sense. The ash and sulfur dioxide that Toba hurled into the stratosphere formed a global sunblock. An atmospheric dimmer switch turned so far down that sunlight barely warmed the ground. Average temperatures plunged by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius worldwide. And that's an average. In some regions, the drop was even more savage. Now, a few degrees might sound like a light sweater problem. It's not. During the last ice age, the average global temperature was only about 5 degrees Celsius cooler than today, and that was enough to bury continents under miles of ice. The volcanic winter that followed Toba didn't bring gentle snowflakes or cozy nights by the fire. It brought killing frosts in places that had never seen frost before. It shortened growing seasons until crops, if you even had them, failed year after year. In tropical zones where early humans foraged and hunted, the vegetation withered and animal migrations collapsed. Imagine being one of those humans. You don't have stored food. You don't have insulated houses. You've got whatever you can hunt, gather, or dig out of the dirt. And now, most of that is gone. The rivers run low. The forests thin out. Animals you depended on disappear or drop dead from starvation. And the cold wasn't the only enemy. Fine ash particles settled into the lungs of animals and humans alike, scarring tissue and triggering lethal respiratory infections. Water sources became sludgy with grit. Every step outside was a reminder that the very air and earth had turned against you. In some parts of the world, the darkness lasted for years. Even long after the skies cleared, the altered climate lingered, with weather patterns so warped that whole ecosystems simply never came back. And through it all, the human population began to crumble, squeezed, quite literally, toward extinction. Which brings us to the most chilling part of the Toba story, the bottleneck. Some disasters leave ruins. Toba left us, barely. Genetic evidence today points to something strange in our past. All living humans are shockingly similar at the DNA level. Much more so than you'd expect for a species spread across every continent. It's as if at some point we were all squeezed through a narrow tube, a genetic bottleneck, and only a few survivors made it out the other side. And that tube? It lines up uncomfortably well with Toba's eruption. Some scientists believe that before the blast, the global population of Homo sapiens may have been in the hundreds of thousands, scattered in small bands from Africa to parts of Asia. But after the ash fell and the volcanic winter set in, those numbers could have plummeted to as few as several thousand breeding individuals. Think about that. A species that today dominates the planet, reduced to a community smaller than the crowd at a high school football game. For the unlucky majority, survival wasn't a coin toss, it was a losing bet. If the cold didn't kill you, starvation might. If you found food, you risked crossing paths with predators desperate enough to try their luck with humans. And if you escaped all that, disease waited patiently in the wings. The survivors were probably huddled in the most resource-rich refuges they could find. Places where plants still grew, where water still flowed, where game animals still staggered through the frost. East Africa, parts of coastal India, and maybe a few sheltered river valleys in Southeast Asia might have been safe zones. Everywhere else was a slow-motion death sentence. And yet, against every odds, they held on. Somewhere in that small remnant of humanity were your ancestors, the people who endured cold, hunger, and years of unrelenting scarcity, and still managed to pass life forward. But their world was gone. The land they once knew had changed shape. The migration routes of animals shifted. Entire ecosystems had blinked out like candle flames, which meant that even for the survivors, the challenge wasn't over. Because climbing out of a bottleneck isn't just about staying alive. It's about learning to live in a planet that no longer plays by the rules you grew up with. If you were one of the few thousand humans left after Toba, daily routine wasn't a thing anymore. Every sunrise, when the ash-thinned sky even let you see one, was just another roll of the dice. The cold was relentless. Nights were bone-cracking affairs where frost clung to your hair and breath froze on your skin. Fire wasn't optional. It was the line between life and death, but wood was scarce, soaked in ash and hard to find. The people who could make a spark were as valuable as food itself. Speaking of food, good luck. The volcanic winter had gutted plant life. Tubers and roots you once dug up for easy meals were buried under frozen earth. Fruit trees stopped producing, grasslands shriveled, and with them went the grazing animals you hunted. What was left were thin, desperate creatures, deer with ribs showing, birds too weak to fly far, scavengers picking at whatever scraps they could find. And you weren't just competing with other humans for those scraps. Lions, leopards, wolves, predators that had lost their usual prey were now eyeing you. A lone human in the open was no longer a hunter, they were meat. Even at night, the dark wasn't empty. The quiet rustle in the grass could be a jackal, a leopard, or someone from another band of humans as desperate as you were. Shelter wasn't much better. Caves were prime real estate, dry, warmer, and defensible, but they were limited. Bands fought for them. Others huddled in makeshift lean-tos pressed into cliff faces to escape the wind, always knowing that one storm could rip everything away. Disease loved this world. Huddled bodies in cramped shelters meant coughs and fevers spread like wildfire. Wounds festered. Malnutrition made immune systems weak. And ash in the air meant breathing itself could make you sick. But even in this near-dead world, humans found ways to endure. They learned to track animals over longer distances. They dug deep for roots in frozen ground. They made alliances with other groups, sometimes temporary, sometimes lasting, because shared knowledge, shared food, and extra watchful eyes could mean the difference between living and vanishing. And slowly, painfully, this fragile network of survivors began to stitch itself into something resembling stability. But they were still standing on the knife edge of annihilation. One bad winter, one failed hunt, one outbreak of disease, and the whole thread of humanity could have snapped for good. What saved us in the end? That story is written in the ash, the bones, and the ice itself.
For centuries, the Toba eruption was just another ghost in the human story, a catastrophe whispered in the rocks, but with no name. It wasn't until scientists started poking around in some very odd places that the puzzle pieces began to click. One of those places? The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. Layer by layer, ice cores are like the Earth's diary, with each year laid down as a band of frozen air bubbles, pollen, and dust. And buried deep in those cores, researchers found a layer so loaded with volcanic ash and sulfur that it stood out like a crime scene fingerprint. That fingerprint matched perfectly to volcanic glass shards found thousands of miles away, in India, Malaysia, even the depths of the Indian Ocean. The ash grains were microscopic, but under a microscope they had the same distinctive chemistry, born in the heart of Toba. It didn't stop there. In lake beds across Asia and Africa, sediment layers told the same story. A sudden, thick band of ash, followed by years of stunted growth in plant pollen records. Coral reefs in the tropics froze their growth patterns for months. Cave stalagmites stopped adding layers entirely for years, as if the planet had hit pause. And then there was the human evidence. Archaeological sites that were bustling with activity before the eruption suddenly went silent. Tool-making debris and hearth remains vanish from the record for centuries in some areas. Where they return, the style and technique have shifted, as if entire communities had been erased, replaced by survivors adapting to a new, harsher world. Perhaps the most haunting clue is in our own DNA. Geneticists found that the diversity in modern humans' genetic code collapses to a narrow window right around the time Toba erupted. In plain English, there's a good chance we're all descended from a shockingly small pool of survivors who lived through this global nightmare. All of these breadcrumbs, ash in the ice, glass in the ocean floor, pollen in the mud, mutations in our genes, point back to that one moment 74,000 years ago when a mountain in Sumatra decided to rewrite the rules of life. But the case file on Toba isn't just about the past. It's also a warning. Because this wasn't a one-off freak event, the Earth has done this before, and it will do it again. Toba isn't just an ancient ghost story. It's a recurring nightmare in Earth's playbook, and like any nightmare, it has a nasty habit of coming back when you least expect it. Volcanoes that can rival Toba in size are still out there, and they're not politely extinct. They're called supervolcanoes, and they're very much alive. Yellowstone in the US, Taupo in New Zealand, Campi Flegrei in Italy. Each one is a ticking clock buried under your vacation photos. Scientists monitor these giants obsessively, measuring every quake, every bulge in the ground, every whiff of sulfur from their vents. Because here's the thing. Modern civilization would not shrug off a Toba-scale eruption. Back then, our species was small, scattered, and mobile. We could move away from the worst-hit areas. We didn't have cities to collapse or supply chains to disrupt. Today, one eruption like Toba could ground air travel for years, crash global agriculture, and send economies into freefall. The volcanic winter it unleashed in the Stone Age would now play out in a world of 8 billion people, who mostly get their food from tightly tuned industrial farming systems. And unlike in 74,000 BC, we'd know what was happening, which is its own kind of terror. The news would tell you exactly how bad it was going to get, and exactly how long the cold and famine might last. But here's the lesson Toba really leaves us. Humanity survives by adapting. We are here today because a few thousand of our ancestors learned to endure a frozen planet without losing hope. They didn't have disaster preparedness kits, weather satellites, or global relief networks. They had each other, a fire, and the will to keep moving forward when the world told them not to bother. That's why scientists study eruptions like Toba so obsessively. Not just to marvel at the scale of destruction, but to understand the resilience it takes to outlive it. Because whether it's a volcanic winter, a comet, or some disaster we haven't yet imagined, the question isn't if something like this will happen again. It's whether we'll be ready. So the next time you see a quiet mountain sitting on the horizon, remember, it's only quiet for now. Because somewhere deep under its skin, the Earth is still writing the next chapter. And maybe, just maybe, it's already sharpening its pen. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep one eye on the sky.